Good morning, everyone, and I'm shutting myself up.
Are we live, are we, Kelly?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Welcome to this Upper District Council briefing, Monday, 24th of March, 2025. The briefing Revenue and Finance Policy Review, Step 2, March 2025. Okay, so presenting this to us today for this briefing, we have Christine Toms, Manager, Revenue Services. Welcome, Christine.
Christine's online, but I'll just, she's been ill for the past week, so I'll just talk to the key point and then transfer over to Bronda, who's been helping us through this process. So Council decided not to use CV for the 25-26 annual plan, but to do another review for 26-27. And in order to get that review sorted by this council, we have to start now. So that's why we're starting today. But it's actually it's about 18 months in advance. So the council now has to look at what the annual rate components are, what the feedback from the consultation was, and what changes do you want to make to the principles, so that the Bronda can then look at various percentages for the next time. There's a couple of corrections, just my haste. You'll see, I think on the first slide I put for the Revenue and Financing Policy 25-26, this should be 26-27. And when I was writing, because my revenue manager was away, I couldn't check that the swimming pool is actually in parks and facilities, not in district leadership. I wasn't sure if it was a grant or if it was what it was. Anyway, that's where it's an open parks and open facilities when we get to that. And it's detailed correctly in these slides. Okay, so over to you, Bron.
Thank you, through you, Chair. So really we just want to, we'll come around to have a look at what we want to base the general rates on. So that's what we're talking about today. The others, we're not reviewing any of the other rates. Stormwater's stayed as it was in the previous Revenue and Financing Policy. So really what we want to be able to do today is to go through, look at what was presented previously, what was discussed by the community and the feedback that we got very briefly. So you've already been through that as part of the deliberations. And then re-look at the principles that we used to help guide what the differentials, etc., were previously. So we're just going to walk our way through that. Some of this you've already seen, but I just wanted to bring it back around because really this it's a little bit of a litigious process. This is where councils can get into trouble if they're going to. Most of any judicial reviews or anything that's gone through the High Court is on rating. So we need to be really careful that we get the process correct. And it's getting the process correct that will protect council from being in a space where they lose in court, because if you lose in court, that becomes really expensive. So just once again, and yes, I've slightly changed, had the wrong dates in there because this is from the previous slides. But so we've done step 1 already and we're not looking at that again. Step 1, we've agreed that that's okay. What we're looking at is step 2, which is the completed results from step 1 and considering the overall impact. So that overall impact is where we start talking about where do the general rates lie and what differentials we're going to use, if any, to change the implication of those general rates. And once again, this is where we talked about desired results and backfilled could be at risk, and that risk is going to court because people don't agree that we've done the proper process, and that's really important. So step 2, the completion, is around the overall impact and some things that you need to consider. So these are the questions that have come out of the guidance around what should you be looking at as part of that process to decide where and what differentials might be used and what that impact looks like. And so when we're talking about the general rates, you can see primarily almost over 50% of this is actually around roading and footpaths. And that could be something that we could consider, and we can talk about that later, and whether we actually look to possibly split footpaths out from general rates altogether and look at that separately. But in the meantime, this gives you a breakdown of what's in those spaces and what that looks like as it stands at the moment.
Is it just, if I may, Mr. Mayor, a question on that, just for clarification. So when you talk roading and footpaths, is that all we spend on roading and footpaths, or just say new footpaths?
All
Okay.
footpaths.
So that's all.
So it's all your renewals, all your updates, all your maintenance. That's all the footpaths.
Yeah, understood.
And then how differentials can be set. And this is really important because this is the one that allows us to go through and say, okay, how can we what legally can we use to create a differential against the general rates? And we use one of those already at the moment, which is the land area within each rating unit. And we use that for the differentials because at the moment, lifestyles, if they're under a certain hectare size, 2 is deemed to be residential and over 2 is deemed to be other. So we already use that one as it stands at the moment. But there are others. So how the land is used. The area of the land is according to the district plan. So that's normally when you start talking about zones. The land area, if the land has or can have a service provided by council, and that's quite often used when you're talking about water and wastewater, it's like available service versus actually connected. Where the land is situated, the capital value of the land and the land value of the land.
Can you just explain, when you say the capital value, that's the houses on the land, and then you've got the land separate?
So no, capital value is a combination of both the land value and the improvements.
Yep.
So capital value is both together.
I understood that, but the thing is, at the moment, capital value has no relevance in terms of what's, we're dealing with land value at the moment, right?
Yes, you are. Yeah. So this is around how differentials can be set across the board. So it's not just based on what you're looking at the moment, it's what you can use for differentials.
There's a hand up there from Councillor Lambert. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, just to go back to that almost 50% of roading and footpaths, does that include the subsidy or not? Are we just talking about the council spend, or are we talking about the overall spend after we are subsidised at present 92%, but up to 80%?
Yes, it's the net per year.
So it's just the amount that is as part of the general rate. Of that general rate is 50% is roading and footpaths. So it is just the council portion at 38%. Yes.
Yes.
So, wow, so that as actual spend is way off the scale and everything fades to insignificance really once we get the subsidy on top, eh? Am I got that right or am I got that wrong?
No, that is correct. In the general rate, so we're talking about the general rate only at the moment, 50% of that is for roading and footpaths.
But then the subsidy is added on top of that.
On top of that, correctly.
Not
Yes, that's
included in
correct.
that. Wow.
No.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Now, the one I did want to point out is about land use. And that actually is about how the land is used. So it can't be anything else other than land use. And we do need to be careful when we're talking about that because there are a couple of definitions that are used from the Officer of the Valuer General rules. Valuer General and the rules that they apply to how we can specify what land is. So we do need to make sure it's about land use. And I'll talk about that a little bit more when we come to that.
When you say land use, so is that what we've currently got our groupings based on?
So the groupings that we did for the last round. So at the moment you have residential is based on it being used as a residential process or a lifestyle if it's less than 2 hectares. That is purely about the land use, but it also uses size of the land. So it's a combination. So even if that piece of land is in a zone for commercial, if it's used for residential, it's deemed to be residential. So that's the differentiation between land use and zoning. So if you use zoning, which is number 2, it's where it is based on the district plan. So whatever the zone is. So if you're using something outside of what the zone says, then you still get that zone applied. Where land use is what you're actually doing with that piece of land. So like I said, if you're in a commercial space, but you're using it as residential, it is deemed to be residential. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we come to the end around some of the information that's been provided.
Councillor Larson, followed by Councillor Vincent.
Yeah, can you hear me, Your Worship?
Yep, loud and clear.
Thanks, Bronda. So with regards to our rating database, the properties are allocated into their use categories based on what they're used for rather than what they're zoned for. Is that correct?
There's 3 different categories that are normally attached to a land parcel. One is what zone they're in. One is what use they have, and that's normally in the rating rules, that's based on a number. So like that's the categories that they use. And then there's a property category, which is best use. So that's CPO, that's the best use of a piece of land. And I'll use a Martinborough example because it's the easiest to talk about because most people get the idea of it. In Martinborough, there are still a lot of sheep and beef farms, but there's also a lot of wineries. The best use of that land might be a winery or a vineyard, and that's what its property category will be based on, but it's still being used as a sheep and beef farm. It's use of sheep and beef. So that's where we need to be really careful that we're using the right things to differentiate against the property. So property categories can be used at times, but they need to be adjusted for what is the best use, the same as the actual use.
Is it rated on its best use?
No, it's rated on has to be differentiated on its actual use. So hence saying how the land is used, it's not its best use, it's actual use.
So Bronda, on our rating database, are all the properties classified on how they are actually used?
As best as we know at the moment, yes. Now that's around making sure that there's been a look at those categories and that use is agreed. But yes, there is, based on the numbers, there is a attachment to each of those properties as to whether, what area they are based on their numbers. And there's about 70 of them.
Yeah.
But when someone receives their valuation from QV, it says on that valuation that council's valued it based, or QV have valued it based on the fact that it is commercial or industrial or dairy, like you're saying in category 1.
Yeah. So the issue that we have is that there's a difference between when it gets valued and what that market value is based on its actual use. So if I go back to the Martinborough example, it might be being used as sheep and beef, but there is a component of that value that will have the fact that it could also be used as a vineyard as part of the value, but the actual use is sheep and beef.
But that's fine. All I'm trying to get to is that we have the information in our database to the best of our knowledge, as up to date as possible, that we know the land use, and therefore we can use your differential set on the basis of how the land is used. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you.
We need to make sure that we're using the land use, not the property category.
Okay, councillor Vincent.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Mayor, and my apologies for being late. I was the traffic lights helping out. Yes, I had in my head, you've sort of answered my question, but I'm still confused. I had heard the term highest and best use of the land.
Correct.
But whereas what you've explained is that we use the actual use of the land as the basis for determining the value for rating purposes.
Valuation is a different scenario. So what we can use for differentials, when we come back to the differential process, is the actual land use. So like I said, if it was being used as a sheep and beef farm, that's the differential that we would be setting it on. The valuation is a different scenario. And the valuation is done by QV, and they go through and say, well, what would this be valued at based on market value, et cetera, at the time for rating purposes.
I'm just thinking of the example of a produce packing shed, which is in effect an industrial activity on a rural property.
Mm-hmm.
Would you address that?
Normally you would look at the primary use of the block. So if you look at the primary use of the block, and there might be multiple uses, but the primary use might still be vegetable growing vegetables. But a part of that vegetable process still has an industrial component to it for the packing. But that's the primary use of the block is for growing vegetables.
So you'd go with the primary use rather than trying to subdivide the use within one property.
Correct.
Yeah. And I guess you could also relate that to the forestry situation where there'll be, say, farmers who livestock farmers who have forestry blocks on their property, but the primary use is livestock farming.
Correct.
As opposed to, let's say, a 10-hectare plantation there, as opposed to a 10-hectare property, which is all on pine trees. Its primary use will be
Forestry. Yeah. Correct.
Well,
Thank
fine
you.
with all that. Thank you.
Councillor Nair, followed by councillor Lambert.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have a couple of questions. I'm not interested so much in understanding land use because I think that is what is being there and we don't have to reinvent the wheel. I'm more concerned about the effect on rates. So my question is more related to number one, you did mention that we want to avoid that confrontation with the lawmaking authorities if we don't do it right. I don't know what are the issues in which council can go to the court.
So the bit that what we need to do is when we're going through and doing the process is that we go through and we set the principles that we're wanting to define what we're trying to do with the general rate. What's the principles behind it? And we had a set of principles last time. What we're wanting to be able to do this time is revisit those and say, are they still the right principles? If they're the right principles, then what was in the feedback that we didn't get that might mean that those principles need to be adjusted because this is what the community wants and therefore the principles need to be reviewed. Once we've agreed on those principles and we understand that, then we apply those principles to both how we're going to rate, so whether it's land value or capital value, and then also if we're going to apply a differential, how would we apply that, using which ways to do it. So as long as council has followed that process and it's deemed to be a reasonable, as long as it's not so far off the planet that you can't make that choice, the law, case law has shown that it's sided with councils because they have the legality to be able to actually make that decision. But
Just,
it's the process that we need to make sure we get right.
Thank you.
Is that-
So just, yeah, no, that's good. Jess, is it Jesse? I can't see the face of the presenter, but through the chair, just literally want to clarify this being online, is to avoid that possibility in any case. Have we? I don't know what differential is right. That's not never the issue. Whether we go 1.5 or 2.5, that is not the reason somebody will drag us to the court, right? Are you there?
Are we asking me or the chair? Right?
Yeah. So all I'm asking is, we are going with some, whether we go for 1.5 or 2.5. I mean, can't we just learn from other councils what is the normal practice rather than reinventing how much differential we should use?
If we come back to that you need to base it on your community, and each community is different because of the makeup of that community. And therefore, what would be right in Kaipara or Selwyn or anywhere else might be slightly different.
Thank you.
And the example I'll use at the moment is Wairoa, and a lot of people know about Wairoa and going through the courts around their forestry differential. The Forestry Association and a number of forestry entities took them to court. That actually ended up in the Supreme Court, and Wairoa Council won. And the reason that they won was that A, the process was correct, but also B, that they were making a decision based on what was right for their community. And the community was disappearing because forestry was taking over, and they ended up with a complete change in their community based on that. And that meant that putting a differential on the forestry meant that the people who were being left behind weren't being unduly burdened. So
That's
there was
great.
what's right for their community is different than what might be right for Kaipara. So that's why it becomes council's responsibility to walk through the process and make sure that they are comfortable with what's happened. Why you might end up in court might be because you put something like 2.5 on a land use. The bit that you come back to is as long as you've got, you've followed the process and you've followed the principles that you've set as part of the beginning of the process, that you are covering yourself for that being something that you wouldn't win.
That's great. Thank you. And if Mr. Mayor allows me for the last question, I may not be asking any more questions. Can I?
Yeah, one more.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Just, I mean, to, as they say, cover our butt. So this information, what we are going through now, is it done in-house, or we can put the blame on someone else in case we have to be dragged? Like any outside consultant or expert has helped us in doing this or not? Thank you.
So no, you won't be able to put the blame at my feet. And the reason being is that I'm assisting you in the process, but the decisions are council's decisions. So I'm sorry, but that will be at council's feet.
Thank you.
Councillor Lambeth.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Your previous discussion may answer a lot of my questions about the loading we have on for forestry. It's pleasing to see that there is a precedent case, which I don't think we're getting too dissimilar to what Wairoa is going through at the moment. So that is pleasing to hear. But one thing that in relation to what Auckland are doing with Airbnbs, now that's a residential zone property, but they're deeming that it's a commercial use because of it. Would that also happen here?
Yes, that could happen here. You could.
Okay, and if you, oh, sorry, and if you could just comment about the forestry too, that do you realise that we've got a very similar situation here in our district with forestry diminishing our rural areas?
So through the chair, I'll have a go at answering that. So the forestry, what our roading people do is look at the roads that they're going to do maintenance for that are related to forestry, and it's kept separate and then put over the properties that are deemed to be forestry properties. So that's a special rate going on this. So what you're looking at with a differential is what's the component of what's actually making up the general rates, and how can I spread this on the different areas, and as we've got set out there, how the differentials can be set. And then once you've done that, does it look fair or is it affordable? And you make decisions into that, and you might bring something back. So you don't have to have your general rate spread exactly as you think that it might be spread. Like, you know, if there's stuff there for commercial, because there will be things we're doing, economic development for commercial properties. You don't have to have an exact link, but there has to be some sort of decision that you make to make it sensible why you've got a differential.
So, and I like to use the word appropriate. Fair is something, it's a tax, and ultimately fair is a hard word to apply to when you're dealing with tax. And so appropriate is probably the best word you can use in that space. And that allows council to be able to go through and say, okay, is it appropriate that, and we used this as a definition last time, that commercial properties, especially at that high end, were quite in low, if we stayed on land value, those commercial properties, because we're only looking at the land value, had relatively low rates in comparison to what their commercial property was able to be then as a benefit. So that was one of the principles that we used last time. So, and this is the principles that we need to come back and have a look at to make sure that we're happy with those, and what does that mean? If the principles are correct, then what's the next step? So that's what we're trying to determine today.
Okay, so if I may, can I just ask a clarification question on that? Our rating system for our forestry relates to roads and is a completely different animal than the Wairoa one. Am I correct there? And if in light of that, would we need to change to the Wairoa one to keep ourselves safe and have a proven system?
I can't answer that without delving into the numbers, and because the bit that Wairoa had done is they took about 3 to 4 years to come back to their differentials that they decided for roading, and had spent quite a bit of time on analysis around both the commercial, the economic, and the wellbeing impact on the community of where forestry was at. The size of the forestry blocks that were happening, how many jobs had been lost in the last 10 years to the community based on that forestry. Without knowing and understanding that information for your area, that would be quite hard to determine. So once if that's the road that you want to go down, then that would be something that we wouldn't be able to accomplish by the time you're expecting to do that this time. But that if council is considering that as an opportunity, then that may be something that can be looked at in the future.
Could you just clarify if we're on CV or LV?
They are now on CV.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, next on my list is Councillor Vincent again, and then Councillor Howard.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I guess just breaking over the existing information really. If say as we went through the process this previous time, and we came to the conclusion that in spite of what the submitters said, it was still the best overall decision for the Kaipara district to go with CV and differentials that we were proposed to go with. That might have given rise, I'm just checking, that might well have given rise to appeals, objections, whatever. However, if we had followed the process correctly and we had the right reasons for doing that, as I think we had, then that would well have stood.
Correct.
So we've actually been more responsive to the people who have been opposed to that proposal as a capital value system. So I guess now we're looking more to see if there's a way in which we can tweak the proposal, well, and so to enable it to achieve what we want it to achieve at the same time as, I guess, provide less resistance. I had the impression that there were a number of, this is not really a question, but you've confirmed my thinking so far. A lot of the objections were from people who found, contrary to what the theory said, we're going to have suffer a massive increase in their rates when they shouldn't have, because it was residential property, which, you know, and lower value, and their rates were going to go up. Yeah, and that's where I thought some of the problems were in terms of individual properties, and I don't know how we can identify that. Is that something in the formula that needs to be tweaked, or what is it? Or a differential rate?
Yeah, and look, I'd need to go back and individually look at each of the responses as to what that meant and where they came from and which property they were talking about. One of the things, and if I just keep walking through, then we might answer some of the other queries, unless there's another hand up that I.
Do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, it may encompass all that, and just the clarity of where we're going, what we need to do. So there's our process now, basically to review the principles and the rules, right, of each the categories that we're talking about. Yeah, I guess how we've already defined that we set these all the categories for rating, and be happy that we've got the right principles.
So, yeah, so what we want to do is review, so as we walk through, review the information that was provided as part of the feedback.
Yeah.
And then go back and have a look at the principles and say, do we think we were on the right track?
Yeah.
Do some of those principles need to be changed, or are we happy with them? And if the principles are still the same, then what in the differentials would we change to possibly make those principles, to make sure that those principles are still adhered to,
Yeah.
while possibly looking at changes to the way the differentials are set?
But because you've got the process that we've been through, hearings, etc., you've got personal protection, you know, I don't want to pay more rates and things like that. So you've got to get that equalisation between the objective view of where we're going and what the subjective views are from some submitters.
Correct. So it's council's responsibility to, based on their knowledge, and taking into account the views of the responses, as to whether what they've put forward as a proposition is correct. And if that is looking at it based on if you did it purely on submissions, the answer to that is right, you've stopped. You didn't go forward with it. But it is still council's responsibility at that point to say what is best for Kaipara based on the principles that we set. And if that is then deemed to be by council going to CV with differentials that are set based on whatever those differentials we come up with, and whether it's 1.55 or 1.2, whatever those differentials are, if that's the right thing to do, then that is council can make that decision.
So I'll just clarify what happened as we went through, because our differentials are just one on residential and small lifestyle blocks up to 2 hectares and 1.55 on the balance. So when you use that for land value and then you transfer it to CV, you actually have less costs on your land, you know, those with greater land value if they don't have as much improvements. So that's why your rural people seem to benefit and the residential didn't. So, and I imagine, you know, I wasn't here when we originally set those differentials, but I imagine the original 1.55 was to represent, on the rural, was to represent the cost of roading, because most of the roads are out in the rural area. So that didn't change the 1.55 when we went to capital value. So that's what caused, I think, the issue.
And particularly now as we find that roading is 50%.
Of the cost, yeah, the cost. It's about $14 million. So it's a huge amount of money.
So rural people don't have footpaths. Because if we're talking about the footpaths, sitting out the road and the footpath issue, that again would alter the differential, wouldn't it?
Well, no, because we didn't base it on that.
No, but I'm saying going forward.
We could look at how much, we don't think we spend that much on footpaths.
No, it's political.
Yeah, it's almost.
And that's what some councils, where they do spend, like city councils, would actually split that out and say that's a commercial, potentially a commercial and residential value that sits with them.
And,
If you were going to do that. But
and presumably there are areas like in an urban, a specific urban area that, we should be able to allocate footpaths against.
but I'm not sure we want to get down to that detail, and we possibly can't. It might be just, we can go through the process, see where we get to, but that's what's actually happened in the past.
Yeah, so this is what we're talking about, the current differentials. So the 1 and 1.55. And this is the bit out of the revenue and financing policy as it stands at the moment. So really, the 1.55 was primarily because of the roading network and the extent to which they contribute to the cost of that service. So that was, the 1.55 was both on rural, commercial, anything that wasn't residential. So it's pretty much for everything else, utilities, the whole works. But with land value as being the basis.
So could you actually get to a point where, let's say, as we're going on this process, for residential, rural and all the other property types, could you actually have different differentials to, like, I'm just trying to get my head around
Yes, you can.
rest of it and the whole process.
Yeah.
Is that how that would be, make a better balance in each of the,
So the bit,
yeah.
there's a fine line between, and remember, we're only talking about the general rates here. All the rest of the rates are, water, wastewater, they're all targeted based on going to the people that are actually primarily using those services, other than there being a bit of money sometimes coming into general rates because of, but there's a little bit of, the more complex you get, the harder it is for people to understand. And I always call rating a bit of a spider web. You pull one corner and the whole thing changes shape. So you pull a corner for roading and footpaths, well, then you almost need to look at what's left over as a separate process. So that's where, there might be a decision of council that, yes, footpaths is such a big component, why don't we look at that separately and then look at the rest of general rates? That can be a decision of council. That can be a decision of council that we leave that on land value and do the rest on capital value. So those are some things that you can put on the table as part of that change of where that sits. But
It's not going to be substantial enough footpaths.
no. I don't mean I'm riding our footpaths together. Or you could say, okay, take the roading out, leave footpaths in with general rates, and then let's see what happens. So there's a number of components that you can split that up with. The only thing I would say is that if you keep it as simple as possible, it's more understandable by ratepayers. The more complex you get, and I'm working with a council at the moment that has 270 different rates. It's not easy. So, so we just need to be careful, because every single time you tug one of those rates, the whole shape changes. So we need to make sure that we're coming at this with. So really, what we want to do today is nail down on those principles, and then once we've had a conversation around the principles, what does that mean? What do we want to look at? So if we can keep going with that, that'll be good. And this was when we talked last time, why the differentials needed to change. So this was what Christine mentioned earlier, is that, sorry, not Christine, sorry, Sue, that mentioned earlier is that if we left the differentials as they were, there was a double whammy. So that's, and when we talk about the multiplying effect, you get the capital value going on because they've got higher capital values, and then the differential on top, they get that double whammy for commercial rates. So we realised that we probably couldn't leave commercial at 1.55. That was the discussion that we had last time. And then we reviewed a couple of different options, and we don't need to go over these again. And we settled on 1.55 and 1.2.
1.1.
1.1. Sorry. So this was the results that came back from it. So in support was about it being more equitable and fair. That was probably the biggest one. The other one was around the CV being more connected with wealth and ability to pay, and we know that it's as much as we can find out about people's ability to pay, based on the fact that the only information that council has other than what's available from statistics is around the CV values. The oppositions, and this is where I probably wanted to point out that the biggest opposition was around affordability and continued rates increases, which for all intents and purposes is not a revenue and financing policy decision, that's a budget decision. Revenue and financing policies is about the same pie, but just who pays for that pie versus are the rates going to increase overall? So that's the bit we probably, the consideration of that affordability and continued rate rises. I can understand that definitely in some spaces, but rate rises primarily is around budgets.
Got a question up here from Mr. Nair.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, Your Worship. Just one question. I was looking at how Wairoa did, and I'm surprised they did a very good job. Now, what we are trying to do is play with the differential in terms of 1.5 or 1.1, and looking at the dynamics of Mangawhai and Agawil in terms of especially residential property. What they did is they took 0.9 rather than even 1 differential for property which are valued over 1 million, which can give good relief to Mangawhai people. And then the commercial, they went up to 2.35. Now coming to Councillor Lambert's point, which is very valid, the forestry can be 0.7. That's what they did. And we have a large rural population, which can also be at 0.8. Can't we follow that model? Because they went through a lot of submissions like us. People don't agree with CV because we went out with a blanket thing. These are your values, and you can't have each property valued in the same model. So is it possible to follow that model at all? Thank you.
So the bit would come back to council talking about what they wanted to look at and whether that was relevant for the Kaipara community.
Yes.
Might be correct for Wairoa, but council needs to decide, is that correct for Kaipara?
Well, I would really, if I can, I would really like to have numbers based on these numbers, because it looked very representative of the situation we are. We don't want to overburden Mangawhai because the property values are over 1 million, and we don't want to make the rural areas suffer, which we were looking at discounting. So we give them relief at 0.8 or whatever it is. Forestry is another matter, which is not so much we have that we should charge them 1. So, it will be good to have those numbers at some point. Thank you for that.
So through the chair, so we did look at 1.2 for commercial, and we ended up going to 1.1 because we thought that was fairer. And we're not comprised of big towns that spend a lot of money on beautification of town centres. A lot of Wairoa might be one of those towns or has towns that they do that. So that's why it might be higher, and that's why it's all different to each council. You've got to look at your expenditure, what you're actually providing for each area. So it may
So-
be that
sorry.
you want to put the rural up, but
So the bit we need to do first, before we actually start looking at what those differentials should be, is coming back as a council to decide whether LV or CV is where you would like to be. If it's CV, then what are the principles that we're going to look at as part of that process for changing from LV to CV? That's the first thing we need to decide.
Councillor Vincent?
Thank you. So what I've just written here is, if we do anything to change the status quo, there will be winners and losers.
Correct.
And if we modify the differentials so that there is no change, then there's no point going for it all, is there?
And in fact, actually, based on the information that we've had previously as legal advice, is that is actually illegal to do. So for all intents and purposes, we need to come back once we said, like we said, are we wanting to go from LV to CV? If the answer from council is yes, and we need to determine that today, then what are the principles that we want to use to help define what their answers are? And therefore, if that's the case, do we use differentials? And if so, on what basis?
So my understanding is that when we put it out before, we had so many large differences in people's rate assumptions versus what they were paying under LV. That was a very negative. It got a very negative reception. And so what, the only thing I would ask Rhonda is, in these returns of people's submissions, do you think a lot of that was driven by perception rather than understanding?
That could be the case. Because when we looked at and sorry, I don't have it up, but when we looked at the information around where those changes were, it was a relatively condensed bell curve, and there were definitely people at the other end. There were, those large commercial properties, some of the supermarkets, etc., had some big changes. There were some big dollars that were going into that space, which was one of the things that council had agreed, but they wanted to be as part of the principles. And there were some people that were coming down at the other end. As part of that, if you looked at it from a residential point of view, there were people who were with smaller values who were going down because the percentage or the ratio of the house or the capital value to the land value was quite low in comparison to some of the other houses, primarily in Mangawhai, because of the capital value that's attached to those houses compared to the land value. So there was not only a change. So when you go from capital land value to capital value, you almost always bring money out of the rural community into town, because you are hitting those commercial spaces and the high residential spaces, because their ratio of land value to capital to land value is quite high. So you're taking the instance off one to the other. And when we looked at the numbers last time, that was correct, in that the higher value properties in Mangawhai were going up more, and Dargaville was actually probably getting a little bit of, I don't want to call rates relief because that's not the right word, but that they were going down in comparison because there's less value in Dargaville than there is in Mangawhai. Per property on their individual values, because it's still a portion of exactly the same pie. So as you get a bigger commercial, if you get a bigger CV value, then that grows.
But I thought some of the submissions we got were from people whose rates should be going down because it's a lower value property, but they were seeing an increase based on what they tested on the councils.
So overall, residentials were going up overall, because the CV value versus land value was bringing more value into town.
In contrast to rural.
But when you looked at it, those lower value properties, and and look, I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head because
I think it identified there was something like 6,500 properties that were going to either go down from $400 to $100
correct,
in their rates.
correct.
Still a substantial amount of a decrease for people.
For some people, correct, yes.
Yeah.
And for others, and look, I'd need to go back to this, to the pack to show what those bell curves showed, but it was still relatively tight. It wasn't a massive swing either way. The bit I suppose that you run into is, like you say, is that when people look at their rates and say it's going up, why would they see that as being the correct thing to do when they're looking at their own individual property in isolation?
Yeah, I'm talking about it from a personal perspective. It's
Correct. Yeah.
I think we've got to look at it as an overall district
Perspective.
perspective.
So when you're talking about, I'm sorry to interrupt, when you're talking about you setting your principles and then take away that word fair and use appropriate, the differentials can be used appropriately to try and smooth it, the introduction of the CV. So she might, Councillor Vincent's concern is that why bother if it's not going to change anything, but it's about change over time, I would think we're trying to achieve.
Yeah. And that is an opportunity council can look at, in the fact that it might be that you start commercial off at 1.1, but over the next 3 to 5 years, you increase that differential. That's an opportunity that council can have a look at.
Right.
If you want.
Sorry, no, Sue?
So just through the chair, just to clarify though, if you want the changes to residential and rural, then you have to look at potentially allocating more of the roading costs to rural than residential, than the others. Otherwise, all you're doing is playing with commercial.
Right, okay, that's how.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. It's slightly off track, but I'm sitting here and following everything pretty well, but so much of it seems to me come back, as you say, to our decision. Okay, we've got to make decisions, but there's an awful lot of subjectivity in this that we're making. So, given the universities of rates as the income generator, is there no modelling done to help with this?
And sorry, in what sense?
Well, setting, I mean, it may be, I understand with the principles that you've got to take them to individual districts, etc. But in terms of where you come to setting your differentials, is there no modelling guidance?
Well, the modelling guidance is what we presented to council as to what your definition of how you're wanting to make the impact of those rates, overall impact of those rates across the board in your community. So that's where it is, I want to use the word subjective, but it is the decision of council as to what is appropriate in your community for where that instance of rate should sit.
Yep.
And it's, so some of that is around, well, then how do we split up the rates? What differentials do we use? And as I said, you know, if roading is one that's creating the biggest noise, then is there an opportunity to split roading out from general rates altogether and use that as a completely separate process? I'm not saying council needs to do that, but that is an option. And when you, I suppose the decision of council is around, and it's a well, what would I call it? It's subjective, but it's an educated, subjective process because you are making a decision on behalf of your own community.
And I get that and agree that it's a very considered subjective education, but as long as it's subjective, it means it is challengeable to somebody else, and you'll never get total harmony.
Correct.
So that's all I thought there might have been a system out there that we were missing or not using. And as you say, because the whole essence that we come up against is subjective. People say, rates are too high, don't we?
Yeah.
You know,
So that's where the one thing that the legal process gives you is quite a concise process to make those decisions. And if you follow that process and you're not so wildly out of kilter that someone would say, no, that's, that wouldn't be sane, that councils are protected by saying you are voted in by the community to make those decisions, and council has that right to make those decisions. So you're protected by two things. One is the process that you follow and making sure you follow the process, and then the legal case law to say we don't want to invalid rates where councils have gone through a proper process, have considered all of the options and have made a decision of council, then the case law is on council's side. So it's getting the process correct and using that case law. As long as you're in that process, then you are covered. But it is a qualified decision of council based on the fact that you are representatives of your community, have been voted in, and they are giving you that choice to make with a consultation process included.
that clarifies it, as well as possibly can be done.
Correct.
So that's off the top.
Hence me banging on about let's go through the process, set the principles, decide whether you want to go from LV to CV. If that's still a decision of council and council thinks that's the correct way, if that is the answer, then we'll go back into the process again. If the answer is no, we want to sit on LV, then we pretty much will stop, unless you want to then look at the differentials because of one way or the other. But
I think that there was some information requested on February the 11th to get some information on, I don't know, it was I think it was the amounts in each of those categories that we collect in the general run. Is it possible to get figures on each land use under land value? How much we collect from each category currently under land value?
yes, we can give that to you.
Yeah, because I think setting the principles up front, it kind of went a bit sideways last time. I think it's almost like the process I find.
So if I take a step back, if it's council's decision that they want to set rates and have the instance of rates fall in the same place as it was previously, then you stay on LV. If council's decision is that they want each category of land to get exactly the same general rate on CV, then you are backfilling a process and you will be up for judicial review, and people can choose that, which is why I was quite adamant at the beginning when we talked about backfilling and coming at it from a already decided process, that's where you will end up in court. If someone really decides that they don't want that, that's where you will end up. So that's why there is a really strong process around setting your principles, deciding what that is LV or CV the right way to do it? If that's the decision of council, then we can start looking at differentials and how we would set those differentials to show that the overall impact across the community is living within those principles as we set those differentials. And that's the bit that most councils we struggle with. For all intents and purposes, though, there can be a move towards a process, as we talked about earlier, where if you're saying that was a too big a hit on commercial, but in the first instance, but we might be able to change it over 2 or 3 years, that is an option.
Well, that would be the goal, wouldn't it? It would be to, well, you'd have to review it anyway as you're going along. When you change something,
Yeah.
you then have to be looking and perhaps, yeah, open to having to review that, of course.
Absolutely. But what you can't do is say, this is what we were doing on LV against those land use categories. We want CV to be exactly the same. That's,
Well, no, not exactly the same.
yeah,
No. Because that's not taking into account the larger commercial, you know, the supermarkets, the Fonterras, of course it needs changes.
correct.
It's just, yeah, learning how we.
So the bit that we need to do first, and that's what we need to answer today, is come back, is LV to CV, is that still a consideration of council? And if that consideration is yes, we want to go to CV, then let's look at those principles that we're wanting to apply as part of the process. Are those principles still the same or should they be different? And then if that's the case, then we go and look at those principles as part of the process. And one of those principles might be, yes, we want commercial to go up higher, but we're willing to see it be a, 3-year process, if that's the case.
Yep.
So we can take some time on doing some of those, and then we can work that into the scenarios. But we need to relook at those principles first, once council's decided that is it LV or CV.
Okay.
Can I just ask another question as well? Within a category, so let's say commercial. My mindset kind of is, so you have what gets collected now. If you put that CV over it, isn't it going to already automatically within that category change because CVs are higher for those larger commercial properties? Like, isn't it already going to do a shift naturally?
But we'll do it within commercial only if you keep commercial at exactly the same value of general rates. So it will take it off the bottom end of commercial and put it on the top, but it's not doing anything to rural. It won't be doing anything to residential. So that's where you're.
But can't you set that within each category though? Because isn't that how you get the natural shift of those higher end? Yeah,
So, but what you're trying, you're trying.
Saying is there is still a shift within a.
There will always be a shift within the categories when you go from LV to CV, because across the board, some of, within that category, some of them will be lower and higher, and therefore one will go down and one might go down and one will go up based on that move. What we need to decide today is council still considering, subject to consultation, of course, is CV the correct way to go? And if that's the case, then what are the principles that we want to consult on, and what are the principles are we applying to that process? Are they still what we had before? And so if I can come back to this is the change in the differentials from 1.55 to 1. And then if I just flick through to there, these are the principles that were set last time. So the first bit that we need to talk about is council subject to consideration still thinking that CV is the correct process for Kaipara going forward?
We're talking, is our focus just upon, taking initiative, Mr. Mayor, but on seeing that commercial properties will pay a greater share of the rates take, or are there other objectives as well? Yeah, I don't actually have a problem using the word fair or equitable. So, that's a value judgment, as Councillor Mike's saying.
Yeah, so if we answer the first question, which is the LV to CV, does council still consider that at the moment being from land value to capital value, considering what we've talked about as the process of what happens with capital value and understanding what that means is that capital value is the property value that they would like to consider general rates for.
I think the principles we first looked at are still summed up here pretty well, and I support those. Councillor Naya, followed by Councillor Lambeth.
Thank you, Your Worship. In few words, I would like to say I do support, as Mr. Mayor said, the principles are clear. The move to CV is a good move, but is badly executed at the moment, because I think the submission, obviously submitters looked at a figure coming to them through the calculator, going through the roof. There is need to work on those differential, as you mentioned, on those principles. Look at differential as the impact of moving to CV, and we have to reduce those swings as we do in all those 4 categories. So I think it's an exercise, and we go back to them with better numbers and modeling, as Councillor Howard mentioned about. We need to do a bit of work, and we should probably, I mean, if going too far, engage a consultant to give us some information on those modeling. Thank you.
Councillor Lambeth. Councillor Lambeth.
Yes.
Oh, he's there.
Yeah, sorry, I just got myself off mute. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. My summary of what you're saying is that the differentials are going to get us into trouble. Am I correct there? If we go for CV, the differentials are going to be deemed as being illegal, or will get us into trouble, and we've got to get rid of those.
No, that's incorrect. Sorry. What will be illegal is if you try to make the differentials match the LV, the general rates, as the same as LV as it would be on CV, because you're trying to backfill those processes. It doesn't mean that you can't use differentials, and in fact, differentials are legal. They are a tool across the board for councils to be able to do that.
Thank you, because that what leads to my very next question or statement. When we consider the elderly population that we have in our district, they do not have the ability to go out and earn extra money. They've probably made a conscious decision to move to this district, and they would have done their maths on what they are actually paying now. If we're going to start stuffing with their budgeting and where they've come from, it leaves them in a position where they, I've got to be very, very careful of this, because a lot of those elderly aren't in a position to go out and get a secondary job or to start another business venture to pay for a massive increase in rates. Just bear that in mind, please, everyone. Thank you.
So just following on from Councillor Lambert on that point, and I think this is where the subjectivity comes into it. And yes, we know we've got plenty of residents. We've got more residents than we had last year who say they can't afford their rates, and that's a genuine concern. But at the end of the day, even though we're trying to get more equalisation, at the end of the day, we come back to the budget side of things and what we're wanting to achieve, and that's what's pushing up the rates costs. Actually, the differentials and all of those elements aren't making a substantial amount. You know, what do we think about an average of about, the maximum was about $600 up or $600 down. I might not have that correct, but on the table.
There were some bigger swings than that, but the majority were in that.
That was in the commercial industrial area.
Correct.
Right. So, and that was logical and fair. So at the end of the day, I think, it's hard to say this, but you've almost got to take out the platform that people will say, I can't afford my rates and all that, is I don't believe that, well, it might have a small factor to it, but it comes down to our operations and our capital projects and everything, and what our real drive is each year to survive and deliver the services that we need to. So there is an absolute necessity in there. And we might have to say as part of this that we're going to have to prune our expenditure by another 4 or 5 million. So, and just be brutally hard about that, because fundamentally, that's the only way we're going to start reducing the rates. And I must admit, you start thinking forward of another 4 years of, even if it was 9%, another 36% over 4 years, 45% over 5, that's where the multiplier factor happens. So to me, I think it's like, no, it's a tool, rates are a tool. And then in there, what we're talking about, CV, LV, the differentials, they're the tools we've got, but they are not the arch enemy. The arch enemy is the base costs coming out of effectively operating a council.
Yeah, we've only got so many levers we can pull and altering these things. This isn't necessarily the bad thing, because we know that there will be decreases for people. We don't know who those people are going to be, but I would imagine it would be some elderly and a mix across the board. I think you definitely hear from the ones that it's going to increase and impact, of course. I don't think a lot of people realise that there were decreases there for people too. It's not everything's going to go up. I think we need to communicate it better when we go out, and we need to have it really, like you say, simple so people can understand. And yes, there are decreases too. I think they got lost in the whole way that it was presented to the public, to be honest.
Any further questions? Carry on, please, Wanda.
So this is a possibly a show of hands of the LV to CV scenario. Or is council still in agreement that CV is what we want to look at?
Yeah, I still want to look at it.
Yeah.
Is that
CV.
Yeah.
okay? Rightio. So that's the first thing. The second one is just understanding the principles. Are there any changes to those principles that you would like to make?
Can I ask you, is there any that you would think that we should consider? Because I'm happy with them. You're the expert, you are.
I have a question, Mr. Mayor.
Hang on, let's want to get answered first.
Am I allowed to take the fifth? The bit that it comes back to is the consideration of council. And I think the work that you did last time to go through and decide what those principles were was sound.
Okay.
I think there was enough debate around the table around what those principles should be. And we had quite a long conversation about those principles, and I think everyone was in agreement by the time we finished. The bit that you might want to add to it is the consideration of looking at the instant impact of those differential changes, and whether there is room for us to be able to time some of those a bit better. But we don't have to put that into the principles. We can do that as part of the conversation when we go through to say, yes, this is going to have a really big impact in year one. Maybe we spread that out over 3 years.
Okay, I think that really helps us, Bronda. Thank you.
So can I?
Sorry, so you can add
Can I add, just from my experience, past experience, is looking at the costs themselves, like roading, looking at the district and trying to work out, are these related to commercial, are they related to roading, and get a better, rather than what we've done is we just basically say it's a differential here, but you sort of take another considered look at who should actually be bearing the costs of those. That might be one way also to have a look at, wouldn't it? And that would could change how you spread, how your differentials end out.
That's correct. And one of the considerations that we could possibly put on the table, which I as looking at the roading impact, because it is 50% of that general rate, and do we need to consider the impact of that separately for what's included in there versus everything else? So I don't think that changes the principles, but it might change how you look at that as an entirety.
One of your principles could be looking at the general rate expenditure and where it logically falls. But then, and then if you looked at that, then you might smooth some of the answers because of the results, because of affordability or things like that you wanted to that sort of impact.
Okay.
I'll just say this.
Hang on,
I'm sorry.
sorry,
Can I have my hand?
Rachel, I think I've got Ash, Mike. Did you have your hand up, did you? Ash, Mike, Mark, and then yourself. Way you go, Ash.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Yeah, looking at these principles, the three of them, while I have general, kind of agreement, I have issue with number 2, whereby you say recognition of wealth and ability to pay, and you say somewhat linked with CV. I mean, that's not the case, because you can be living in a $3 million house on your, as Councillor Lambert pointed out, and on a super. So you cannot say that they have the ability to pay just because their house is $3 million. So I don't know how we can go around it. There are simply oversimplifications when you look at these outcomes you want to achieve. We generally want to achieve just one outcome. The people have not understood CV. If we can make them understand how it works, the people who have ability to improve will pay more, as long as we also know that the differential will look after like over 1 million and 0.9, the rural one at a lower differential, and it will be a very, very presentable situation. So I think it's more to do with when the principles we are, the outcome we want all of us on the same page. We want a good outcome for ratepayers, but I think it's an opportunity for us to do it better when looking at differential is probably the most important aspect.
Thank you.
Do you think so? Do you think so?
Yep.
The
Next one,
Yeah,
this is
thank
Mike Howard.
Thank
I
you.
didn't have my hand up for that.
Okay, must have been Mark.
Yeah, okay, cool. I was just wondering if we might include, because like we're acknowledging that generally speaking, rural properties will see a reduction in rates. And perhaps we need to say, well, it's part of a reason why we're doing this. Firstly, we have a differential which acknowledges that roading is the main benefit to rural properties. The effect of the capital value rating will be to also acknowledge that, we're talking generalisations, that they have less readily available use of those other services which rural areas would take for granted. So that's a rebalancing of things, and I haven't said it very elegantly, but along those lines.
You mean urban then? You said rural. Didn't you?
Yeah.
Urban.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that if we're, rather than just know that rural properties would be better off for this, we should front foot it, what I suggest as a principle. It's one of the reasons why we're doing it, because on the one hand, we've covered off the roading with a differential, but on the other, we're also recognising that rural properties have less readily access to those urban services and facilities and so on. Would that be a useful thing to include?
That would be a decision of council.
Yeah.
So if everyone agrees with that as a consideration, we can include that in the understanding and the principles around what we're doing.
I think we're then being more open about what's going on. For people to agree or disagree.
Councillor Lambert, followed by Councillor Howard, by Councillor Williams. Oh, sorry, Councillor Williams was next. Councillor Lambert, then Councillor Howard after.
Just while we're working through all this, I'm just really mindful that the full council isn't here. And also, I think if we've kind of put some of these different things into the mix that we are talking about, do we have to set the principles today, or can we actually go away and get our head around that? And there's another briefing coming up where we can be a bit more, like, if this has all just happened now, not everybody is here and not everybody is moving forward at the same pace. Because otherwise it's, if somebody else has got different ideas and principles, then we've already moved ahead. I just thought if we had the information we've asked for and different things leading up to the next briefing, is that a bit more cognizant of what?
Timelines.
Yeah, I just.
So there's two aspects to that. One, this isn't the first time round we've had these conversations around the principles and knowing that this is what we wanted to do today. The second one is, I would agree with you if we had, there wasn't a time pressure based on wanting to make this decision before the elections. If that was, a council had decided that that wasn't required, then that would mean that we would probably stop now, and we would consider that after the election.
Well, I'm just looking, because we've got a council briefing up our sleeve if we need it on the 7th of May.
It's correct. The bit that what we wanted to do is that if council agrees today that these are the principles that they're wanting, I've got two lots of differential conversations to be able to have, and that's only in 2 briefings. If we had 3 or 4, then we might be able to do that. How many of council are missing today?
Kira, Jonathan.
Yeah, and Vera and Jonathan.
Yeah, I don't know, I'm just.
Basically, going on from that point of reference, do we have
The principles.
slide with all of that?
I just tried to find it on it.
There is no principles in the revenue financing policy. It's around the decisions that were made last time, other than the so these are the principles that were here last time.
Which one's that?
That's on that slide. Those were the principles that were decided when we did this last time.
Okay, well, yeah.
Yeah, there was one more for stormwater, but that we took that off the bottom. The only other principle that was in there was the principle that was we'd shown earlier, which was the differentials were put in primarily because of roading, the impact of roading on the general rate, and that's where the 1.55 and the 1 came from. So those are the only principles that we've got at the moment.
But sorry, Mr. Miller, didn't you say earlier, Rhonda, that all of these principles are related to the individual categories?
No, this is the principles are why you're wanting to go from LV to CV. Yep, these are the principles as to,
Yeah.
and so what you use is the principles then help guide you with what you're wanting to do after that process. So what are we, when we go from LV to CV, what are we wanting to see? Last time it was agreed, it was moving to CV to ensure that those commercial properties pay, their fair share or appropriate share. The recognition of wealth and ability to somewhat linked with CV, understanding that if someone has a higher paid property, whether they actually are on super or can get a reverse mortgage or any of those scenarios that are available, possibly there more than someone who doesn't have a high value property. We don't know the answers to that because we aren't allowed to know the answers as to whether they can pay or not, because of we're not an income tax, we're a wealth tax and rating. And then also the other one that we wanted to look at the differentials, because the impact of moving from CV has large swings to commercial and residential. So that's what we talked about last time.
So with Mark's, so through the chair, with Mark's point about roading, would we be able to look at the categories of expenditure within the general rate and relate it more to the categories?
Use of the land.
Use of the land.
We can do that as part of the analysis, which we can bring back
We don't have to
next time.
to the principles, we can leave the
We
principles.
can do that as part of the next, yeah, correct.
Okay, happy with that, Mark?
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, it's really complicated. I'm just trying to work it through with you. Yeah.
Because that would be a way to look at the broad.
We could definitely use that as one of the measures that we use to see whether the differentials that you're applying are appropriate.
Jonathan probably would approve, because I've got the idea from him.
Good on you. Councillor Lambert, did you have your hand up before?
Yes, I did, and still got it up, so I'll take it down after my question. But nobody knows more than what this council does that I'm a big supporter of the rural sector, and that's what supports this town. When we have a look back at the amount of roading budget there is in our overall budget, when we consider that our urban areas are very, very isolated in a small area, a lot of that roading budget goes on to serve that rural community and their produce and their manufacturing out on the farms and everything else. So we know that the move from LV to CV is going to benefit the farmers and they're going to live from it. But I want you to also consider, are we considering how much of the roads they need to run their day-to-day operation and how much is spent on roading just to support that large rural community? I know it's a sort of, I'm complimenting them on one hand and I'm smacking them on the other, but yeah, it's they will become the real winners out of this, and there's no two ways about it. And whether that roading amount should be considered in it as well. Just to add a little complication to it all.
There's so many ways of looking at it. There's so many ways of considering it.
Yeah.
Talk about appropriateness. There's so many ways of looking at it because a lot of the urban community is so reliant on the success of the rural. So it's a little bit linked in that regard. Councillor Howard, you're next, and then Councillor Knight.
So, look, I'm probably not going to help anything here because I'm looking at that second principle, recognition of wealth and ability to pay it somewhat linked to CV. But it's actually, we don't know. You know, we can't determine wealth and we don't know the ability to pay. What we're going to do is get the fairest system that we can structure that we can across the whole district, because we have an amazing variation of people and situations. So I've started thinking how we can better fight that one, because I think that we run the risk of people who maybe aren't in that wealthy sector or in their inability to pay, verbally having a real go at us, because you know when the rates come out much higher or whatever. So I'm thinking that there's got to be a principle of basically around fairness somehow or another. So I'm just starting to think about that. And, you know, at the end of the day, you're trying to be fair with your rates and whatever way you go, whatever system. So we've got extra pressure, as I see it, that by adding CV into the mix, we're really wanting to show people that it is fair. But it won't be because someone's still in place. So, I mean, I think that's really, I'll leave it at that. I'm still considering whether it's even worth doing. I mean, how do other members feel about that line, recognition of wealth and ability to pay? It's somewhat linked. See, is that a principle? You think it is?
You got any comment to make about that, Rhonda? I think we've gone around just about traverse, because it's pretty good.
Yeah. So almost every other council across New Zealand is now for its general rate is based on CV. And the reason that has happened over the years is the improvements that happen on the land. If those improvements create wealth from whether it's on paper or it's actual wealth in their pocket, there's a consideration across councils that CV is more appropriate in that space. And that's not me just saying that, that's a substantial number of councils across New Zealand. And I did the calculation up, and it's about 3/4. It's quite a large portion. Because we don't know whether people are wealthy or not, they might be sitting on a house of $3 million.
$2 million debt.
Yeah, exactly. And look, I could be a devil's advocate, and I have been in the past, and said if that person is sitting on $10 million worth of debt with a $11 million house, then would they be in a space where they can afford to pay for the mortgage? Then should they not be able to afford to pay for rates? Yeah. And conversely, if someone's sitting on a $3 million house and they're only on super, then are they in a space where, and I'm being very, very devil's advocate here, are they now, and they can't afford to pay, then are they in a house that they can't afford anymore and therefore should be on selling and moving to somewhere smaller? Or back mortgaging it, or any of those other opportunities, because there's the wealth there that they have the ability to call on that other people in smaller houses with smaller wealth won't be able to do. Now, I'm being absolute devil's advocate there, and I know that's not how a lot of people consider when you've worked really hard to get to your old age and you've got this house that you're wanting to sell.
Can almost seem like a cruel thing to say, because it's
Absolutely.
themselves up to retire and the other on.
Totally. That's why I'm saying I'm playing devil's advocate.
I'm gonna wrap this up with one last question from Ash, and then I think we've given you direction. Are you satisfied? Yeah.
I think we're all on the same path. I don't think the principles necessarily need to change. I think there's some consideration that we can do that Sue mentioned around coming back and saying where some of the costs lie and where we would consider those to be, who receives the most benefit off them, and whether that has any impact on the ability to change what we've done as that stuff being in the general rate, and whether there should be some ways that we work that through, either by leaving it in the rate and then using the differentials to change that, or splitting it out from the rate.
Okay, you got one last comment there, Ash, please?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just want to save this council from courtship, not courtship like court cases. And I don't agree we should try to bring the fact that 50% rates are spent on roading, and the fact that whether rural uses more road or the urban. So I think these are the kind of thing we should avoid. I have objection to number 1 language, move to CV to ensure larger commercial property pay their fair share. Looks like the whole thing is designed to make them suffer, the 3-4 commercial property. I think we used to change this language. The larger residential property as well will be paying more. So it's not only the commercial property. So it's just a little typo, whatever you want to do on the first principle. And then all I'm saying is, let's forget about who is using road more on all those things. It doesn't help anyone. I'm sure the urban people are driving 100 times on that little path than the rural people. Yeah. So thank you for that, Mr. Mayor. I think we are all on the same page. It's just that we should cover our butt, as I said before, by using the right language.
Thank you, Ash. Look, I'll just briefly get whoever to take us through the timelines, so we're all aware of it. If there's any questions on that, just quickly. Page 12 is start with that, isn't it? Yeah.
So this is the timeline that we've set at the moment. So today is we're doing the first briefing. The next briefing is to bring probably the impacts of what we've discussed today, and some of the looking at some of the differentials, what that might mean, and where some of those costs lie. And then we've got a briefing on the 30th of April, and sorry, that was in yellow because that was a placeholder, but I think really we probably will need to do that. At the moment, we will bring back to the council on the 4th of June, the revenue and financing policy and remissions policies for a draft for you to consider that for formal adoption on the 25th of June. At the moment, it's got the 7th of July to the 27th of July for consultation. That might be pushed a week, primarily because the ability for us to get the new rates into the system and modelled and into the consultation document will be a bit tight. And then with the intention of having hearings and deliberations and adoption before the end of September for the council to make that decision prior to the election period.
Thank you very much for that, Rhonda. I appreciate your ability to impart the knowledge to us that we need today, because it's certainly complicated at
It
times.
is not easy.
Thank you. All right, I'll close this meeting. This briefing.
Thank you. Have a good day. Bye.